In Lesson 8, we learned how we can create data types and objects to represent the data that we need within our applications. We created a person data type to represent individual people in our code. We are going to use that person data type and actually create a new data type called employee, and we are going to do that using inheritance. Inheritance is a concept in object-oriented programming, and inheritance in JavaScript is different from inheritance of languages like Java and C++ and C#. We actually have several different patterns of inheritance in JavaScript, but the most correct is called prototypal inheritance, because JavaScript is a language built on prototypes. So we are going to start actually before the try it section. We have the person data type that we created in Lesson 8. And let's go ahead and get rid of this greet method here so that all we have are these two properties and then the getFullName method. Now every time we create a person object, we create a first name and last name property, and then we create this method here. So with every object that's created, these three members are created. And a member is just a property or method of an object or data type. Now, with these properties, that's okay, because properties are supposed to have unique pieces of data for each object. But this method here doesn't really need to be recreated each time. A method is kind of static. It's going to stay the same because every object of a particular data type is going to have the same method. It's going to do the same thing for each object. So like this getFullName method here, every time we call it, it's going to return the first name and the last name combined. There's nothing that's going to change. There's no reason to create this method every time we create an object. So we can actually put this on the prototype of the person object or the person data type. And the prototype is shared amongst all objects of a particular data type. And prototype is actually a property of a function. So we have person, and then we use a dot, and then we say prototype. Now, remember that functions are values. So whenever we define a function, be it with a function declaration or if we have a function expression, we are actually creating an object of type function. So this person is actually an object. And if we were going to create a function like this, foo is a function object as well. So it's entirely plausible that these objects have their own properties and methods. And so in the case of functions, there is a prototype property. And anything that is defined within this prototype object is going to be available to every object that we create from the person constructor. So we want to move this method outside of this constructor function because we don't need to create it every time. We want to move it to the prototype because then it's created once and it's shared amongst all objects of type person. So here we have specified person.prototype.getFullName, and then we have set that to a function. So now whenever we create a person object, it creates the first name and last name properties, but it does not create the getFullName method because that has already been created on the prototype of person. So to see this in action, let's create a person1 object. It's going to call the person constructor. We'll pass in my first name and last name again. And let's call the getFullName method. And let's run this within our browser. And there we go. We have an alert with my full name here. So how does this work? Well, whenever we call this getFullName method, JavaScript looks for an identifier for getFullName. It's going to look on this object itself first. It's not going to find one because we haven't specified get full name here. But then it will search the prototype of person because this is a person object, so it will start searching the prototype. It will find get full name, it'll see that it's a method, and then it will execute it because we have used parentheses here. So it's a lot like scope in that if it can't find an identifier within this object itself, then it moves to the next level, which would be the prototype. And if it can't find the get full name method on the prototype, then it just comes back and says, I can't find this, it's an error. So we can actually use this to override the get full name method here for this person1 object. So if we wanted to customize this, and this really isn't something that we want to do because we want to keep get full name the same regardless of what object that we're using. We could do person1 and then get full name, and then we could set it to a new function. And let's just alert ha ha ha, I broke you. And then let's call this again, person1 get full name. So let's refresh our browser, and then we get this alert message here. And that's because whenever we use get full name, we now have an actual identifier of get full name on this person1 object. So it finds this here, and then it returns the function, it executes it, and then it stops looking for it because it has found a match for it. It doesn't need to look on the prototype. So we really don't ever want to do this. There are very few instances of when you want to do it, and even if you want to do it, you ought to think, do I really want to do this? Because the whole point of having methods on the prototype is so that we don't have to recreate the same method over again, because methods aren't supposed to change. So what does this have to do with inheritance? Well, the prototype is part of the puzzle as far as inheritance is concerned, and we are going to get to that in a few minutes. So let's get rid of this code here, and let's write a function to create employee objects. So we have a function called employee. Note the capital E, because this is a constructor function. We need first name, last name, and then we need the position of this employee, so a manager or a programmer or some other position within the company. And we want a position property, and we will assign it the value of the position parameter. And we also need a first name and a last name property. Well, we want to inherit from person, because it already has the first name and last name properties for us. Putting them here would be a little redundant. And it would also require us to write more code. The whole point of inheritance is to write less code. It's code reuse. So we want to create these properties for the employee object somehow. And we can do that by using the person object, which is a function object, and every function object has a method called call. Now the first value that we pass to call is the object in which we want person to execute as. So we are calling person as if it was an employee object, and then we pass in first name and last name. And we essentially create the first name and last name properties for employee by using this call method here. Because once again, we are calling person as if it was this object, and this object is an employee object. So whenever this code executes, we execute person as if it were employee. So this in person refers to an employee object, and it creates these properties for us. So we have part of the piece of inheritance solved by creating these properties within this constructor, but we also need to get the get full name method here. And we do that with the prototype of employee. So we say employee.prototype equals, and then we call the constructor of person. So we are creating a new person object and assigning it to the prototype. Employee now fully inherits from person. We get the first name and last name properties by calling person as if it were an employee object with this call method. And then we get the get full name method by creating a new person object and assigning that to the prototype. So if we were going to create a new employee, let's do var employee equals new employee. We will specify my first name and last name, and we will give myself a position of programmer. And let's do alert and employee get full name. Let's run this in our browser, and we will see that we are getting Jeremy McPeak, which is the method of get full name here. Now, we actually want something different for employees. Instead of just returning the first name and last name, we want to have their position as well. So we actually need to provide some customization to this employee object's get full name method. So we'll do that by first saying employee.prototype. And then we will say get full name. So we are essentially creating a new get full name method here. And we want to use the value from calling get full name here. So the first thing that we'll do is create a variable called full name, and we will set it to person.prototype.getFullName.call. Once again, we are using call, and we are passing this. So we are essentially calling this method here, person.prototype.getFullName, as if it were an employee object. So it's going to return the first name and last name of this employee object and save it in the full name variable here. Next, we want to add our position to our full name. So we'll do a return full name, and then we'll concatenate a string that contains a comma and then a space, and then this position. So to go over our new get full name for employee, we call the get full name method of the person prototype as if it were an employee object, because we're passing this to the call method. We are getting the value of this first name and this last name, saving it to the full name variable here, and then we use that variable to return a string with our full name, a comma and a space, and then our position. So if we were to run this again within our browser, we see Jeremy McPeak, comma, space, programmer. So this is how we can use inheritance to reuse code that we have already written. In this case, we are reusing person to create a new data type called employee.